Isto está ligado, está. Bom dia a todos. Vamos então dar continuação às nossas jornadas. Eu vou falar aqui um bocado em português, um bocado em inglês e começaria então por cumprimentar todos os que estão aqui presentes, os membros do painel em primeiro lugar, as pessoas que estão aqui também na audiência. Portanto, agora iria dizer isto, vou dizer isto em inglês também. I would like to greet all the members of the panel and all those who are here today. Our first speaker is Mr. Ivan Kuznetsov. Mr. Ivan Kuznetsov is an Estonian national. He's a qualified attorney in Estonia. He has 10 years of regulatory experience, including 2 years in the financial law division in the European Central Bank and over 5 years in the European Commission at DG Financial Stability, Financial Services and Capital Markets Union, and key expertise in EU securities market and market integrity issues. He's a Magister Juris, he has a Magister Juris degree from the University of Oxford, and he speaks 7 languages, including Portuguese. So, without further delay, I'm going to pass the microphone to Mr. Ivan Kuznetsov.
Okay. 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion. Okay, it works. Estimados senhoras e senhores, é meu prazer e honra de fazer esta apresentação da parte da Comissão Europeia neste evento dedicado ao financiamento colaborativo. E, antes de mais, eu gostaria de, sinceramente, agradecer ao CMVM e ao Centro de Investigação de Direito Privado da Universidade de Lisboa por esta oportunidade único e muito importante. E como devido ao meu português não chegar ao nível suficiente para a audiência tão estimada, eu gostaria de continuar a minha apresentação em inglês. So my name is Ivan Kuznetsov and I work in the Director General for Financial Services, Financial Stability and Capital Markets Union. So many of you might already be familiar with the results of our work. We design and prepare the legislation for the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union in the financial services and securities markets area. You might know MiFID, Markets in Financial Instruments Directive, Market Abuse Regulation, CRR, CRD, EFMD, Capital Market Abuse Regulation, Prospectus Regulation, and the list goes on and on and on. So today, I'm very pleased, I'm delighted to introduce our new baby, and the name of this baby is the Regulation on the European Crowdfunding Service Providers for Business. And as I can safely rely on the paternal sympathy from some of you, I can reassure you that the birth of this baby has not caused about sleep deprivation and anxiety. Rather, we are very excited about the opportunities that this regime, the European regime for crowdfunding, will bring about to the European businesses. Now, I would like to take a small step back and to introduce you in a few words the set of measures that were unveiled by the European Commission on the 8th of March together with the crowdfunding regulation. In addition to the crowdfunding regulation, the Commission has adopted the proposal on facilitation of the regime for covered bonds, the proposal for the facilitation of cross-border distribution of investment funds, the proposal for the law applicable to transferable claims, as well as the communication on the law applicable to transferable securities. And all this has been accompanied by 2 communications. It's a very worthwhile read, and I encourage you to go back once you're back to your desks and to read communication entitled Completing Capital Markets Union by 2019, Time to Accelerate the Delivery. and which has been accompanied by the FinTech Action Plan. In a couple of words, the new ways how firms and businesses interact with each other and with investors have created unprecedented opportunities. We will probably hear today a lot about the cryptography, race of the cloud, the cognitive computing known as artificial intelligence and distributed ledger technologies. All these opportunities have presented new risks and new opportunities, and in the European Union, like never before, we need to have a possibility to address those opportunities and assess the risks in order to boost our financial sector and economy. Now, going back to our baby, I would like to ask to think about for a second, so the cause of the rise of crowdfunding as a sector. I personally believe, and this has been already mentioned in the introductory speech, that the reason for the rise of crowdfunding is indeed the over-reliance on expensive and often unavailable unsecured bank lending. And since 2018, we still struggle to reach the pre-crisis levels of lending to SMEs and innovative startups. The Commission has been monitoring the developments in the crowdfunding area for a few years now. Back in 2014, we have issued a Commission's communication, and we have conducted a very comprehensive study and issued in 2016 a Commission staff working document. And at that juncture of time, we have concluded, well, we don't have enough evidence to take policy action. However, we continued to look in very detail at the developments of crowdfunding. And what we have established is the emergence of the barriers between member states and the tendency for the crowdfunding platforms and investors to be very strongly skewed towards the national frontiers and at best regional frontiers. We were often told by the stakeholders, by the crowdfunding platforms, that in order to operate cross-border, they had to adjust their business models. They had to comply with divergent national laws. They had to seek legal advice. They had to comply with the national laws in the area of marketing communications as well as consumer protection. And this is where we decided to step in and to take legislative action. All right, we are now through the first slide, and I would invite you to relax, sit back, as within the next 5 hours I'm going to, well, it's 15 minutes, to walk you through the substantial requirements of the crowdfunding regulation. On scope, so what we define as a crowdfunding service, it's the matching of funding interests between the project owners and the investors made through the crowdfunding platform and through the facilitation of granting of loans. This is the so-called lending-based crowdfunding, and through the placing of without firm commitment of transferable securities issued by project owners and the reception and transmission of orders, the so-called investment-based crowdfunding. The regulation is only covering the crowdfunding offers with a consideration below 1 million euros. And this is almost 100% the case. I already anticipate this question. So why is this limit so seemingly low? And this has to do with the fact that just a few months ago, the co-legislators, the European Parliament and the Council, have agreed on the text of the prospectus regulation, and 1 million euros is a de minimis threshold above which normally the prospectus would be required. The donation and reward-based crowdfunding are excluded from the scope of this regulation, and this has to do with the fact that it's not a business lending. It's not a business lending, and the basically doesn't arise with the same information asymmetry, and this is why some of the existing EU legislation, such as in this field of the protection of consumers, already applies to the reward-based crowdfunding. The regulation also doesn't apply to the situations where the project owners qualify as consumers, and we don't address the crowdfunding where the which is addressed to the consumers lending for the consumption purposes. Again, the rationale here is very similar. This is not a business crowdfunding, and the scope is already covered by some of the existing EU legislation, for instance, the Consumer Credit Directive, Consumer Mortgage Directive, and so on. Very important two important points that I would like to make here, that the licenses are not cumulative with other European licenses such as UCITS, MiFID or FMD. In other words, if you are a European crowdfunding service provider which is authorized under this legal framework, you are not supposed to seek licenses or to seek authorization, for instance, under EFMD or MiFID license, and vice versa. If you are a MiFID firm, you shall not seek authorization or be authorized as a European crowdfunding service provider under this regulation. However, and I will walk you through this a bit further, this license can be cumulative with a PSD license as a payment service provider. Now, very, very important point, the interaction with national regimes. Please let me ex ante assure you that the European crowdfunding service regime is in no way designed to prevent, to limit, or to somehow make an obstacle to the existence of the national regimes. At this moment of time, we have some member states that have opted for the adoption of the bespoke national regimes, and this has been the case for Portugal. Some member states have exercised discretion for the adoption of national crowdfunding regimes within the ambit of either MiFID or EFMD or PSD. Now, we are dealing with an alternative sort of opt-in. This is a possibility, it's not an obligation. So we look at the European crowdfunding services providers regime as an additional, we call it 29th regime, that can happily coexist in parallel to the national regimes, with the difference that the European crowdfunding services providers regime can be allowing such platforms to offer the services on a cross-border basis. One of the important features is that the authorization and the supervision are exercised by ESMA, the European Securities and Markets Authorities based in Paris, and not the national financial regulators, as it is the case with some of the legislation up to now. Now, how to get licensed and obtain authorizations? We feel that we have put in place a rather coherent, light touch regulation. You have to basically prepare some basic documents, your incorporation documents, information about your management, your plan of operations. You have to put together the business governance arrangements, control safeguards regarding the processing of data, some of the outsourcing arrangements that you may happen to have, and that's it. You submit the documentation. 20 business days within ESMA, within which ESMA has to assess whether the information received is complete or not. 2 months after the receipt of the complete package of documents, ESMA has to do one of two things: either to give a green light and to issue the authorization as European crowdfunding service provider, or to refuse authorization. Now, ESMA is charged with pretty common tasks for this regime, which is to exercise the powers of oversight and supervision. It's a plain vanilla set of competences and tasks. It will be able to organize general investigations, on-site inspections. It can seek documents, interview people. There will be an exchange of supervisory information with national authorities. And of course, ESMA will be also equipped with basic supervisory tools and impose sanctions for the breach of the regime. Now, the logical question, which I would of course expect, is, so what's the price tag? In other words, I guess that once I start talking about money, the microphone just decided to switch me off. So
It was my fault.
no, that's right. So what's the price tag? In other words, what would be the cost of compliance and what's the cost of the privilege to be authorized as European crowdfunding service provider? And this is where the regulation says that the supervisory fees that ESMA can impose have to cover costs of authorization and supervision, and they would have to be proportionate to the size of crowdfunding activities. On this note, I would like to say that we don't know the amount of those fees yet, because they would have to be set out in the Commission's delegated act adopted by the European Commission and under the scrutiny of the European Parliament and the Council. But the intention here is really to make a very attractive, very competitive regime. We want to promote this label and we want to make this regime a success. There is perhaps another thing that I should mention, that there is no requirement for the crowdfunding service providers to have any minimum capital requirements of any kind. We don't, and we decided intentionally not to introduce any credit default insurance or insurance of any kind for the European crowdfunding service providers. And the bonus is that once authorized and expanding, scaling up operations to additional member states, there is no requirement to have any physical presence in the territory of the member states where such crowdfunding services are being rendered. In the next few minutes, I would like to just walk us through, without a deep dive in, of the operational requirements of the crowdfunding service providers. Once again, this is supposed to be a very light touch, very proportionate and enabling regime to take into account the variety of business models. There is a general requirement to have a stable and effective establishment, and for the management to have a management which is effective and prudent, and to implement policies which are required by the law. We're talking about segregation of duties, conflicts of interest requirements, arrangements to deal with complaints handling, etc., etc. There is a requirement for the European crowdfunding service providers to also have effective and stable establishment, and to act honestly, fairly, and professionally, and in accordance with the best interest of clients or prospective clients. Very important point is that the European crowdfunding service providers are not allowed to hold clients' funds or to make payments unless they themselves seek authorization as payment service providers, or they operate through a third party that is a payment service provider under the PSD. Now, when the crowdfunding service provider doesn't have itself the license of a payment service provider, it must ensure that if it charges a third party to make any transfers to the project owners, that such transfers must be made through an AML compliant PSD provider. Once again, as you see, I'm going back to the topic of non-cumulative licenses. You cannot accumulate licenses in parallel with UCITS, EFMD and NIFID, but you can have a parallel system where you have the European license as a European crowdfunding service provider and a national PSD authorization. Very briefly about the conflicts of interest, we are looking at two sides, the internal and external. The basic rule here is that European crowdfunding service providers should not have any financial participation in the crowdfunding offers which are placed on its platforms, and there is also a requirement for that limits the participation of the major shareholders. We define it as 20% or management or employees or any persons related to such persons to participate in the projects that are placed on the crowdfunding platform. Now, the inducements, crowdfunding service providers are prohibited to accept any remuneration, any discount, and we define it very broadly, any financial or non-financial benefit for routing the investors' orders to a particular crowdfunding order. There is also a disclosure duty. You have to have a comprehensive disclosure of any discretion if you exercise discretion with respect to clients' orders, as well as comprehensive disclosures of any fees, costs, and charges. Two final points before you fall asleep. The entry knowledge test. Before accepting the potential customer, potential investor and give access to the crowdfunding platform, it's the responsibility of the crowdfunding service provider to measure the ability of the investor to invest. And it's a set of basic questions assessing the investing experience. And in this note, the intention is really to understand whether the investor is capable or not to invest. And to the extent that the platform assesses that the investor doesn't have a sufficient investing experience or has already invested before in other multiple projects, it would have to decide whether or not the experience is sufficient. And if it's not sufficient, you require the platforms to give a risk warning. Another important point is sort of the form of suitability test, and it's basically the ability to simulate the bearing of loss. So if and we measure bearing of loss as 10% of the net worth. So if the investor is investing its capital, then if to the extent that this amounts are exceeding the 10% of the net worth of the investor, then it's again the responsibility of the crowdfunding service provider to issue a risk warning. The important principle, however, remains that the failure to have sufficient knowledge and the failure of the ability to bear loss, if you fail both tests, would still not prejudice and not limit the capacity of investor to invest. Once again, it's invest at your own risk and peril, and we want this regime not to prevent people from investing in those projects that the investors deem are suitable to them. Final point, as you know, in the European Union, we love acronyms. And here I want to give you yet another acronym, the so-called Key Investor Information Sheet, or KISS, which is probably resembling with the KID in the PRIPS. So this is a very short, up to 6 pages document with main disclosures. It has to be prepared by the project owner and addressed for each crowdfunding offer and be made available to the prospective investors and investors. And this is essentially enumeration, and we have some specific set of requirements. Please have a look at Annex 1 of the regulation. It's disclosures about the business model, about the main risks. We also require to indicate specifically in the case that you invest at your own risk and peril. The investment in this crowdfunding offer may bring about total, complete or partial loss of capital. So it's really up to you that this investment is possibly liquid, that it's not covered by the any comprehensive deposit guarantee scheme or any insurance of any kind. So that's the way we want to balance the risk appetite and the risk warnings and the protection of those people seeking riskier investments. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to complete here. Of course, continuing for much longer would be what I see as an exciting exploration of this enabling regime. However, it would not make justice to the wealth of information we are yet to receive from our distinguished speakers. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kuznetsov. Dr. Howe will address now the alternative finance market data. Dr. Howe is currently working with Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance as a research associate and a data scientist. She focuses on the big data analysis, machine learning, database design, statisticals, modeling, and all the technology-driven projects. She's a co-author of several fintech benchmarking industry reports and cooperated with financial conduct authorities to in-depth analyze the UK fintech market. She holds a PhD in Engineering Department, University of Cambridge, and a Bachelor of Engineering Honours First Class degree from the University of Nottingham. She also obtains the qualification of Certificate in Quantitative Finance. Dr. Howe, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi. Hello? Okay, it works. Hi, good morning, everyone. So my name is Ray, and I'm very happy to be here today to give you a presentation to share some of our research findings in our research centers. So, so my presentation here today, it will have three sections. First of all is who we are, the introduction of our center, and the second one is about the global alternative finance market data, and the third one is about the European data. So in the second and third sections, there will be a lot of highlights of Portugal fintech activities as well. And I hope today's presentation will be helpful for you, particularly for the regulators and the interested business people, so you'll understand how the Portugal fintech market looks like. And also we're hoping to have much more conversation and cooperations with the relevant parties from Portugal side in the future. So after Ivan's talk about loads of regulation, show you a much more concrete database of our research today. And first of all, who we are. We are the research center based in the Cambridge University George Business School, and we're doing loads of broad range of the research streams in the alternative finance areas, including the finance channels and instruments, for example, the fintech models, and we're producing the benchmarking reports every year by region globally. And also we're doing the credit and the investment analytics in the research centers. This area involves much more big data analysis. For example, we cooperated with FSI in the UK last year to analyze sophisticated fundraiser and founders research and their behaviors in the UK. And also we do the credit analytics. We are having the world's largest fintech data repository. The third topic we're doing with the research is about the alternative payments and distributed ledger technologies. That's cryptocurrency and blockchains. Those are all very popular these days. And also we are doing the regulation and policy research, including the regulator surveys, the Reg Simple projects. So the Reg Simple project is to apply the machine learning techniques into the regulation document, therefore to make the documents into the machine readable and machine executable ones in the future. These are some highlights of our research. We are having more than 200 citations in the media up to date, and more than 100 policy citations as well. The commission programs has been covered globally, like World Bank, Inter-America Development Bank, IMF, FCA, etc. And our data has been widely used by the loads of regulators and multinational banks as well. And also we're offering the global internships, so for any students or the other interested, the younger participations in these areas, you are very welcome to apply with us through the internship. We are offering the 3 slots every year. And these are the list of some key founders of our center. The second section is about the overview of global alternative finance. So the currency in this section will be the US dollars. We are collecting data from 2013 globally. So in the past 4 years, from 2013 to 2016, you can see the global fintech market data has been expanded dramatically. It reached more than $290 billion in 2016. So this figure shows the total volume by regions in 2016. The largest country in the world is China, so it has more than $243 billion transactional volumes in that year. And also the second areas, the regions, is Americas, and it includes the North America and Latin Americas. And the third areas is the Europe and the UK, and the last is the Middle East and Africa. So within that, we also analyze the business finance. That's the money goes into the business areas. The UK has the highest business finance percentage in terms of its total transaction volume. This is mostly from its regulation side. And for example, in terms of peer-to-peer lending to property, in many areas and regions, and this amounts of money can be considered both by the business or the consumer side. However, in the UK, these amounts of money all flows into the business areas. And compared to that, in Americas and China areas, the business finance percentage is relatively smaller compared to the other regions. And this is the reason because in the Latin Americas and in China, there are much more smaller startups. And also the director of these kind of smaller companies, they borrow the money as an individual person. So we have to record them as the peer-to-peer consumer lending. However, they use this amounts of money into their business though. So that's why these two areas have the relatively small figures percentage in terms of the business finance. The alternative finance top 20 countries in 2016. China is the largest country, occupying around 84% of the global total volumes. That is the USA and the UK. And these top 20 countries have occupied more than 99% in the world already. So most of the countries, they are located in the West Europe and some big countries in the Asia Pacific, like the Australia, India, and Japan, and the other countries in North America. So these are some definition of typical models. So in this one, I wish to highlight the peer-to-peer lending and the balance sheet. So for example, the peer-to-peer lending, consumer lending, which means the founders knows, the investor knows who borrows his money. However, different to that, the balance sheet, the investor, he doesn't know who borrows the money. In contrast, the platforms will donate the money straight away on behalf of the investors. And for the other findings we do here is about the P2P balance sheet, crowdfunding, and other models, the distributions of data in these two different sections of models. So peer-to-peer lending is still one of the most popular used models in the world globally, and also the second one is the balance sheet and the crowdfunding and the other models. Compared to that, we also analyze the business finance in the different sets of models. In P2P, because loads of money flows into the consumer side and property side, so the business finance is relatively smaller. However, balance sheet, because the platform will distribute the monies directly, so platforms tends to gives the money to the larger firms or the business level people. And this is the loan purpose, and still the most people wishes to borrow the money as the consumer usage, and the second is the business, and the last is the properties. In this one, we only consider the P2P and the balance sheet. And these are some other information like fundraiser, founders, average deal size by regions. So in most areas, fundraiser numbers are much higher than the funders. However, China is different from the others. Europe and Middle East and Africa, they are almost balanced in this number of fundraisers and funders. So the reason of this difference is because the saving behavior in China, so the individuals, they tend to invest by themselves in order to grow their own wealth. However, in many other Western countries, people like to borrow the money in advance and then to pay back. In terms of the average deal size, the property level, Americas and UK, they have the highest average deal size. In several areas, Asia Pacific, China and Europe, the top funding industries, they are usually the business professions, so that's why they have a little bit small amounts of money flows into the, considering the average deal size. The least is the Middle East and Africa, so they only do the music and arts as the most popular funded industry. Here, these are some key figures for Portugal. And we are collecting data from Portugal from 2012. So until 2016, 5 years has passed. So you can see this is a really exciting increase in this country every year. In 2016, it has reached more than 4.8 million US dollars activities in the country. And among it, around 3.81 million US dollars flows into the business level. And for the other figures of Portugal in the world, we're serving more than 150 countries globally. However, there are only 144 countries give us the data in terms of the total transactional volumes. Portugal is located at 48 out of 144, so it's just about the 1/3 position in the world for the total volume of fintech market. And in terms of volume per capita, that's the total volume divided by the population size. The rank is around 45 position. The business finance is the similar position as the 1/3 of the global countries. And largest volumes of Portugal flows into the business finance, so that's P2PB. They have the largest volumes transaction. And the second is the reward-based crowdfunding. So for this reward-based crowdfunding, it has been one of the most record models in the country. So we have the most entries in these areas, the popular one, and the last is the donation crowdfunding. My next section will be about the European finance market data research findings in 2016, and the currency in this section is euro. So these are the two reports we have published on our website. You can download them from our website as a free version. One is Expanding Horizons, this is about the European report, and the other one is Entrenching Innovation. That's the UK report. So we analyzed from more than 267 European platforms and 77 UK platforms, analyzed from 46 countries in Europe and plus UK, so we have 47 countries in total. And the increase of the Europe market has been very impressive from 2013 to 2016. And it reached more than 2 million euro in 2,000 million euro in 2016 in Europe, and also the increase of this volume is largely considered from the smaller countries' activities into these areas. For example, many East European countries that have really good performance in 2016. This is the figure of the total volume by European countries, 2016. The top 5 countries, excluding UK, they are France, Germany, Netherlands, Finland, and Spain. And Russia, it is a large country, however, they have very limited fintech activities. And Portugal has reached around 4.4 million euros in this year, and the European rank of Portugal is around 23 out of 47, which just in the middle of the Europe rank. And this is the fintech volume per capita by country. Differently to say, you can see the France and Germany, they are the large country. However, when we consider them to the individual level, the figures are relatively smaller compared to the other smaller countries. Differently, Estonia, Monaco, Georgia, these kind of smaller European countries, they have really high penetration and participation of fintech activities in their own countries. So per capita level, they really ranks in the top 3 or 4. And Portugal ranking this one is still in the middle of the Europe size. Portugal has, it's just around at the bottom of the slide, 0.43 euros per person. And this figure shows the alternative finance volume capita versus GDP in 2016. So this is a fitted line roughly, and in terms of the countries above these fitted lines, for example, the UK, Estonia, Georgia, because they have more P2P fundings, and for the countries below this fitted line, for example, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Norway, they have more non-investment crowdfunding activities appeared in their countries. And the highlights of Portugal, Portugal is just around this fitted line, so which means they're generally balanced in terms of P2P and the crowdfunding activities. So by showing this graph, the regulator can have better intuition about which areas they should promote in the future, either in the crowdfunding or in the P2P areas. And this is the diversity of models in 2016 taxonomy based. In Europe, the most money goes into the peer-to-peer consumer lending, and then is the peer-to-peer business lending. And however, in Portugal, we only have 3 entries of records. That's peer-to-peer business lending, reward-based crowdfunding, and donation-based crowdfunding. And the market share in terms of the volumes that the P2P business takes around 75% of the market share in Portugal. And this is a figure about the top funding industry. The Portugal, we have the records in the reward-based crowdfunding and donation-based crowdfundings. The top fund, the industry, the money flows into the food and drink, art and music, and film entertainment, and donation flows into the charity. And this research findings is pretty similar as the whole Europe market, so which means in terms of the top funding industry, Portugal is quite similar to the other general European countries. And this data shows the qualification rate and successful funding rate. So when the fundraiser approach to the fintech platforms, the platforms will usually initially assess their qualifications. So this is the onboarding rate and qualification rate here. And after that, they are going to make the campaign of the funding. So this successful funding rate means how many, what percentage of the fundraiser have successfully obtained the fund from the platforms after they are considered qualified. As you can see from this figure, the lower onboarding rate, qualification rate, usually means they are higher successful funding rate in the end, which means the more restrict initial assessment of the qualification of a fundraiser, the higher likely they will raise the funds in the future. So it just gives us kind of the sense to think what kind of initial assessment that we should be settled to all the business levels, and trying to promote the entire market, and also at the same time trying to help the fundraiser, the business can be better obtain the money from the platforms. and the reward-based crowdfunding and donation-based crowdfunding in Portugal. These two figures, compared to the whole Europe countries, it is slightly lower, which means the fintech activities in Portugal, it is relatively small and still relatively limited, so the regulator or educator needs to think about what we can do to help to promote the knowledge of the fintech and help to promote the citizens' awareness of using these platforms to doing their own business or the other activities in the future. So this is a repeat funding rate. This repeat funding rate means the repeated fundraiser, so how many fundraiser has borrowed money through your platform previously. The invoice trading has the highest repeated funding rate because loads of the smaller business level, they relied on this invoice trading to meet their capital needs. And so the others, the reward-based crowdfunding in Portugal reach around 2.5% and donations about 25%. And this view shows the female fundraiser and funders. This is important in terms of the financial inclusion. And females, they're likely to have much higher participations in terms of the reward-based crowdfunding and donation-based crowdfundings. And from the business levels, for example, P2PB, the female participation is around 15% to 60%. However, the average, female entrepreneur in the Europe countries is around 30%. So you can still see the gap between these two figures, which means the female participations in the fintech still needs to be improved. Portugal, unfortunately, we don't have these entries in 2016. Maybe because due to the lack of the data and the limited fundraising from the female side in the country. This is a cross-border inflow and outflow of the money. This is important because it's highly restricted by the regulations of different countries. So P2PC and invoice trading, usually there are less barriers across the different countries, so there are much more funding inflow and outflow compared to the others. But generally, equity, P2PB, and real estate crowdfundings, they have higher restriction in terms of the regulation side in different countries, so less activity appears in this one. And that's why it is important for the EU has been proposed a one integrated market, as Dr. Evan just now said. Because the European country, the biggest problem for European countries is our countries has the relatively small and the barriers, so it's pretty fragmented unless the one integrated one. So there are less communication previously, and I think the regulation published last week from EU Commissions will definitely improve these difficulties and disadvantages in the future. The Portugal side of the inflow and outflow, as we can see, the money of the Portugal is relatively maintained into the country, so which means there are less inflow and outflow of the money of the country, and also in terms of international strategies. There are no international strategy plans of Portugal fintech platforms. Compared to that, the other countries, the average to say the P2P companies there tends to expand them more. So it is also bringing us the thoughts that the regulators need to think how to improve the fintech activities here and how to promote them to expand their markets into the different countries, but particularly after this EU new regulation comes out. And this is the risk. The risk performance in Portugal is relatively good, and the fraud shows relatively high risk. This means the campaign may have the false information initially when they provide the data or provide the information to the fintech platforms. The others are relatively small. It is not saying nothing, everything is good here. It is good at the moment because the company thinks they don't have too much high risk, but in terms of the improving of activities of fintech in the future, there may be more and more concerns in terms of their securities gradually, because at the moment the fintech activities in this country is still relatively small. And my next slide is about the perception about the existing national regulations. It is good to see that Portugal, almost all the platforms, they think their regulations are adequate and appropriate. The red areas, the blue area shows us at the moment we are fine, we are okay. However, the rest of the colors, they're showing the regulator needs to think about what they can do to improve their activities in the future. And still, I think that Portugal really needs to be focused on the markets, to be together with the European unions and to see what they can do in the future. The most important thing is regulators need to think about how to improve and promote the fintech activities in the countries, and with a gradual developing of the fintech money and the companies in the future, maybe more and more concerns will appear later. Okay, that's the end of my presentation here. Thank you. Oh, thank you.
Bom, vamos então agora dar início a uma nova apresentação. Antes disso, queria, enfim, já o tinha feito pessoalmente, mas queria agradecer agora publicamente à doutora Rui Hau a apresentação que acabou de nos fazer. Agora o Dr. Carlos Silva irá falar sobre crowdfunding transfronteiriço e passaporte europeu. Carlos Silva é cofundador da CIDRS, é a plataforma líder na Europa em equity crowdfunding e empreendedor residente na Faber Ventures, assim como Innovation Lead na Accenture. É membro fundador da BetaI, uma organização não lucrativa portuguesa para promover a inovação e mentor em vários programas de aceleração. É também conselheiro e membro do Conselho de Administração de várias startups. Tem uma licenciatura pelo Instituto Superior Técnico e um MBA pela Universidade de Oxford.
Obrigado. Se não se importarem, eu vou fazer a minha apresentação em inglês para... I would like first of all to thank the organization for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here today discussing and debating cross-border crowdfunding. By way of introduction, I'd just like to talk very briefly about CIDRS and what we do, and give you some numbers, and then I'll go into the regulatory bit related to cross-border crowdfunding. So CIDRS is the leading European equity crowdfunding platform. We've been operating since 2012. And we were the first equity crowdfunding platform to be regulated by the FCA, the British regulator. As far as we know, we've also been the first equity crowdfunding platform to be authorized and regulated by a financial regulator anywhere in the world. We have a very good relationship with our regulator since day one. And we've worked hard to help them develop what we believe to be a good framework for equity crowdfunding in the UK. We're members of the UK Crowdfunding Association, the UK trade body for crowdfunding, and we're also members of the European Crowdfunding Network. Within these trade bodies, but also at a more individual level, we've liaised with both the UK regulator, but also with regulators across Europe, and with the European Commission on different regulatory initiatives. So we, as a co-founder, I launched Seeders and started working on it back in 2009 while still at Oxford. It took us about a little bit more than 2 years to get to regulatory approval. Part of that reason was because we were the first ones, and as I said, there was a back and forth with the regulator trying to fine-tune the regulatory regime for us to be able to be authorized. We launched in 2012, and since then, more than 600 businesses have raised finance through our platform. Businesses raising from as little as £30,000 all the way up to 5 million, which is the prospectus threshold in the UK. These businesses are mostly based in the UK, but not entirely. We've been operating as a European platform for the last few years, and we had businesses raising from us from Portugal, from the Netherlands, from Germany, Belgium, Ireland, Spain, among others. Through our platform, there has been already a little bit over 320 million pounds, so that's about 350 million euros invested, most of which has been invested in the last 2 years. So we've had very rapid growth since the beginning. So moving into cross-border regulation and cross-border equity crowdfunding. The present situation is where it is not particularly straightforward when you're operating cross-border. So Seeders is a MiFID authorized platform. We're also regulated as a small alternative investment fund manager, but neither of these European regulatory regimes allow us to passport effectively cross-border. While we do have a European passport, there are significant differences in specific countries when it comes to crowdfunding regulations. And the inability to operate efficiently cross-border hinders not only our development, but any other equity crowdfunding, and I would say most crowdfunding initiatives to operate efficiently in Europe. Specifically in equity crowdfunding, Europe is the leading force in equity crowdfunding when compared to the US. The US started with equity crowdfunding later than Europe, and their regulation is less adequate to proper crowdfunding, but they're catching up, and unless Europe is able to operate efficiently as a single market, we will lose that leadership. So we've been involved, and we've provided input in the Capital Markets Union work streams since the beginning. We believe that crowdfunding forms a fundamental part of the Capital Markets Union mission. And we believe that the ability to operate efficiently cross-border is going to be critical for these operations. We are very much pleased with the Commission's initiative to regulate crowdfunding cross-border and to have a more homogeneous regulatory regime in Europe, and we think that the current proposal is adequate and is generally a step forward and something that we strongly support. I think, and we think that the approach is right. It's an opt-in regime that caters both to a framework that applies across Europe, but also caters for platforms that want to be MiFID regulated and platforms that want to operate under national regulatory regimes. So we believe this strikes the right balance from a risk, cost, and time to implementation perspective in a market that is rapidly evolving. That said, we do have our own contributions to the current proposal. All of these notes and all of these comments have already been shared with the Commission, so I'm not going to dive too deeply into the details. I'm going to give a high-level overview of what our position is. Our position will also be published in the European Crowdfunding Network's website very briefly, so you can also check the significant details. First and foremost, the most significant feedback we have relates to the 1 million limitation on capital raising cross-border. We have significant number of businesses raising way above 1 million. As I said, we've operated under the 5 million limit of the UK Prospectus Directive. And we believe that the number of businesses raising more than 1 million will only increase. We also believe that the 1 million limit doesn't cater to the types of startups and scale-ups that the crowdfunding proposal sets out to support. Part of the reason for this proposal is to address a gap that exists in terms of financing businesses that are going from the startup to the scale-up phase and are struggling to find adequate sources of financing. So while the 1 million limit caters perfectly to early stage startups, more advanced businesses, businesses that are either already scaling up internationally or are pre-IPO, which we have a few raising through the platform, will be hindered by the 1 million limit. This means that platforms operating under MiFID or under national regulations will have different limits and will be eventually at an advantage towards the companies that are operating under the European regime. So we understand that, we understand the alignment with the Prospectus Directive. We also understand that different countries want to impose different limits, limits that may be more adequate to those specific countries. And our proposal is a scenario where the limit is increased from 1 million to the maximum of 8 million, but where countries can still impose limits on the amount of investment coming from that specific country. This means that those countries' regulations will still be taken into account, and nationals of those countries and residents of those countries will not be able to invest more than the limit for that specific country, but at a European level, businesses will be able to raise more than the 1 million threshold. Other points that we would like to highlight more for clarification than anything else is, excuse me, is the fact that the way platforms operate implies that they have control over the flux of funds that are being invested. So, for instance, in the case of seeders, we accept payments through a third party that is fully authorized to accept payments. Those payments sit in a client money account that we control. Those accounts are obviously kept in a regulated banking entity. And then we transfer those funds to the businesses if they're successful in raising, or back to the investors if the business doesn't successfully raise the amount that they intend to raise. This flux and this process is particularly important to the way equity crowdfunding works. And we believe that the spirit of the regulation is to allow platforms to continue to do this through third parties, so they will not have to hold those authorizations. But the current proposal doesn't fully clarify this point, and we would welcome clarification regarding this specific subject. Also, the other point that we would like to highlight is marketing activity. Under the current regulation, platforms cannot market individual campaigns and cannot serve as marketing means for those campaigns. We support the view, and we fully understand why this is so. We are strong advocates for transparency and for independence of the platforms in relation to the campaigns that raise money through us. Having said that, the way we've been operating, we think adequately protects the campaigns and investors from discretionary power from the platforms. So what we do and what we believe is a good approach to this is we mention individual campaigns in objective and predetermined ways. For instance, we issue a newsletter every week where we highlight all the new campaigns that are on the website. We highlight campaigns that have crossed a certain threshold, and we don't highlight campaigns that we believe are more interesting to us than others. So we highlight campaigns under predetermined and objective metrics. And we believe that if it is done in this way, it effectively protects both the campaigns and the investors from platforms being discretionary about which campaigns to promote to their investors. So we would like the current proposal to allow for this kind of communication. Also, one thing that we tend to do is to negotiate marketing deals with third parties that we then allow our campaigns to take advantage of. So while we're not the marketing end means for those campaigns, we work as a facilitator in bringing those campaigns to the deals that we've already arranged and helping them promote in our partners. And we think that that's beneficial for everyone involved, including the campaigns as well. Another point that I would like to make is regarding SPVs. So CIDRS operates as a nominee for the underlying investors. That means that we aggregate all the investors that invest through the platform under our nominee arrangement. And while they are the beneficial owners of the shares, we are the ones showing up on the cap table, and we are the ones making the investment and signing all the documents and handling any votes that are needed afterwards. And we keep up with the investment all the way to a potential exit. We think that this is vital for the way equity crowdfunding operates. It's non-feasible for a startup to manage hundreds or thousands of investors in their cap table, and being able to aggregate them is particularly important. The current proposal allows for this, which we believe is important and relevant. However, we think that it would be beneficial for the platforms to be able to have additional authorizations in how they manage the SPV. So authorization to be able to execute the deal, to actually sign the documents and do shareholder agreements, and also to make decisions on behalf of the investors. This, in effect, maximizes the potential for returns for investors, and we think it's good for the market as a whole. Finally, I would like to address the use of secondary markets. So, Cedars has launched its kind of secondary market on the platform very recently. It operates almost as a bulletin board and not as a multilateral trading facility. It's something that we're still developing and testing with and learning from. We want to take it slow because it has been tried before by other platforms and it hasn't worked particularly well. It's slightly tricky and there are a number of unknowns involved in setting up a secondary market for shares in private companies that are so early on in their lives. Asymmetry of information, transparency, and so on are some of the issues that we're trying to address. Having said that, looking at the current proposal, it restricts the platforms from setting up a fixed price for the transaction of those shares. It is our view that this is contrary to the interest of the platforms, the investors, and the companies involved as well. As an entrepreneur and as a very active member of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, I know that from a founder's perspective, having the value of the shares and the share price fluctuate and being exposed to speculation is contrary to the development of the startup and of the business. The way we've addressed this is to limit the transaction of shares on our platform to the share price of the last round that the company did. So the last set price by an external investor. And we don't allow negotiation of that price, which means that the startup and the investor don't have to negotiate price and don't have to try to value the company because the company has already been valued in the previous round. We think that this is good for everyone involved. We think that this protects also the investors. And while I do understand the need to stay outside of the multilateral trading facility regulations and not to become one, we also believe that being able to set fixed prices for the transaction of shares is in everyone's best interests, and it's in the industry interest as well. So these are some of the points that I would like to highlight. These are the contributions that I have. Again, we believe that the current proposal is a very significant step forward in terms of having a European market that can continue to be and become even more a world leader in terms of equity crowdfunding, but also in terms of crowdfunding in general. And while we do think there are some points that may be tuned and may be improved upon, we strongly support the Commission's initiative on this, and we're looking forward to the development of an actual single market in financial terms. Thank you very much.
Bom, queria agradecer ao Dr. Carlos Silva a apresentação. Irá falar agora a doutora Ana Bruxado, do Gabinete de Estudos da CMVM, sobre enfim, o tema da apresentação, Snapshot sobre a indústria de crowdfunding na Europa.
So, good morning. It is my pleasure to join this first panel in the crowdfunding conference. I have not planned to do the presentation in English, so my presentation is in Portuguese, and I will give the talk in English to allow discussion with other panel members. In this session, we have a discussion about new regulation in Europe, the perspective of the Research Center, the Cambridge School for Alternative Finance, that is, I believe, one or the most important source of data about crowdfunding and fintech, and also the perspective from the entrepreneur side and from the platforms. To finish this debate, I'll attempt to present a snapshot of the industry in Europe and to provide a further discussion of some of the data that we have already here today. So, first, I'll provide some data about the trends and figures of crowdfunding, and then I suggest to look for the crowdfunding industry from the perspective of a two-sided market. We have the platform that is intermediary, and we have two clients, the fundraisers and investors. So I propose to take a look to these three actors. First, just to summarize, crowdfunding has received an important growth during last years. Asia-Pacific is the region with the highest volume, followed by the America and then the Europe. Each region has a leader, the US, in America, China in the Asia-Pacific, and UK in Europe. And it's important to note that Europe grown around 40% last year, and excluding UK, the growth is around 100. And according to the data that we hear today, Portugal registered a highest growth, 146. So this is important new data that we can highlight. Crowdfunding has not only increased the volume, but also the awareness from the crowd, from the population. Here I have some graphs with the Google Trends data that records the Google searches that we do in our computers. So according to the IP of each household, we have here the searches about term crowdfunding from the worldwide and from some of the main countries in Europe. It's important to note it is an increasing awareness or a strong awareness about crowdfunding in the crowd. Now let's take a look about a study from the crowdfunding that performed a benchmark about the crowdfunding in Europe, comparing two types of variables. First of all, the volume data, and then the regulation. And according to the index of maturity that combines these two indicators, UK is the country with the highest maturity index. And for Portugal, it's quite interesting because we got a stronger rating in the regulation compared with the volume. So there is room to increase volume data according to this study. Crowdfunding. If we look a couple of years ago from the European Commission reports, only 4 types of crowdfunding were discussed: the lending, the equity, the reward, and donation. But if you look to the new report, latest report of the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, we can see more than 14 categories. That means also that industry has moved by increasing different offering to different types of investors and address different needs. We have already looked to the data. Peer-to-peer lending in the industry recorded more than half of the market share, and looking for the equity crowdfunding in Europe is around 50%. Another interesting result is to look to the onboarding and successful rate that we have already discussed today. Platforms They are likely to succeed if they manage to have a flow of projects with good quality. And according to these figures, you may conclude that the onboarding rate, for example, for equity is around 50%, and the success rate is 78. That means that platforms manage to select the best projects because they are aware of the fact that the quality of the project is a key factor of success. Looking also to the data, different types of sectors appeal to different types of crowdfunding. Again, looking to the equity crowdfunding, it has attracted attention mainly of technology and e-commerce projects. Now let's move to the platforms. Platforms are web-based marketplaces. And one interesting result is, as we have seen, Europe is not the strongest region in terms of crowdfunding volume, but we concentrated the highest percentage of platforms. And that means that probably some concentration issues may arise in the future, as they already are observed in the UK, mergers and acquisitions, because maybe some small platforms do not manage to have enough number of flow of projects to continue their activity. Some platforms, the first platforms that appear on the market have some benefits today, or benefit in terms of market share, awareness, and reputation. Other trends are the specialization by sector and by crowdfunding type. Usually a platform offers mainly one type of crowdfunding. Of course, there are cases where they may offer two models. According to the business models, there are a variety of taxes that platforms practice. Usually in the crowdfunding model, the fundraisers are those that mainly pay these fees to the platforms. And then looking again to the perceived risks by the platforms, one important result is that on the top are the risks of fraud in a platform or due to misconduct in the large project. And this is an important result because there are negative effects that some negative effects might arise on the market if due to misconduct. And if we link this result with the figures about onboarding rate, this could be a conclusion. The highest level of risk linked to this misconduct, and platforms start having concern about quality of the projects and decreasing the onboarding rate. Now let's look to the fundraisers. Crowdfunding targets mainly small and medium enterprises and startups, and for example in the UK, the percentage of this group is around 70%. The European Commission released a manual to the project promoters and highlights that different models of crowdfunding may appeal to different stages of the company life cycle. If the company has an idea, maybe the donation may apply. In the step of project or product development, the reward might be a solution, and if they are planning to increase the capacity, the lending or the equity might be a solution. So this is an important also. According to the literature, there are three main types of motivations to release a campaign. from the fundraiser's perspective. The first, of course, is a financial motivation, an alternative way of financing the project. Then some marketing motivations might arise because it is an opportunity to market and to do the market research and the test market of the product. And finally, also to add to the project with the network that the platform offers and the opportunities to increase the partnerships. What are the key success factors of a project? According to the literature, they could be organized in 4 components. The first is the platform. The reputational platform might have an impact on the success of the project. The second is the promoter, the experience of the team that is developing the project. The project itself, of course, the sector, the amount, the duration, and then also we have here the communication strategy. And according to the literature, the information provided, the video, and so on, has an impact on the likelihood of the project to succeed. And we believe we can have a discussion with the results, with the points for further discussion that is in the new regulation about restrictions for the marketing of individual projects. About this topic, the success drivers of crowdfunding campaigns, I'd like to summarize the results of a study, a paper published in Cadernos de Valores Mobiliários, that is the journal of CMVM, where we studied the success drivers of a set of around 5,000 sport crowdfunding campaigns, and we measured success according to variables, whether or not the project reached the target amount, and then we explained the overfunding. So econometrically, this is a hurdle model, 2-step. In the conclusions, we conclude that projects that with lower target amount are more likely to succeed. Those that are more likely to succeed manage to have the highest number of investors. Comparing the reward and the donation projects have a higher likelihood to succeed than the reward. That may be due to the motivations of the investors in these types of projects. And finally, one important result, projects that are promoted or are and the platforms where we have all or nothing model, that is the promoter only, the fundraiser only receives the amount if the target amount is reached, are more likely to succeed. That might have an explanation that investors try to have trust in the campaigns. And now looking to the investors, the final of these 3 actors, one of the trends in the industry is institutionalization of the platforms. The equity-based crowdfunding usually gathers the highest number of investors. And looking to psychographic variables, there are 2 main types of motivations to invest in a project. The first is a financial motivation, and the second is an emotional or personal motivation. Usually financial motivations are linked with crowd lending and crowd investing, and personal and emotional motivations are associated with reward and donations, this crowd sponsoring, I would say. The percentage of females investing in equity crowdfunding is 15%, and we have just discussed it. Compare it, for example, with Bitcoins or ICOs, is lower, is 5%. So this is a quite interesting result. And just to draw some conclusions, the industry of crowdfunding industry has grown during last years. Different types of models appear on the market. However, there is some heterogeneity, and the growth path is different according to the region. One interesting result is the perception of platforms has the risk of misconduct, has the highest risk, and how they manage to increase the criteria for the selection of the projects and looking to the low onboarding rates and the highest percentage of projects that succeed. And to end, looking for this perspective, this session is about crowdfunding in Europe. I believe that as crowdfunding is an alternative mode of finance for small and medium enterprises and for startups, we know from the literature that the innovation from these types of companies generates the highest level of spillover effects. So they contribute to innovation, to growth, to the employment, to the competitiveness of Europe. And as crowdfunding has invested the crowd, I believe that is also a way to engage the community, the crowd, the population, to increase the financial literacy, finance democratization, and also there is room to increase the culture of entrepreneurship with this alternative mode of finance. Thank you.
Eu queria agradecer à senhora doutora Ana Bruxado. I want also to thank once again all the speakers. Vamos agora dar início a um período de debate. Eu suponho, apesar de todas as intervenções terem sido feitas em inglês, que as perguntas aos oradores nacionais podem ser feitas em português e se quiserem fazer perguntas aos oradores não nacionais, então pedia que fizessem em inglês. Não sei se alguém queira fazer alguma pergunta.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Vinay Prajuan. I am a consultant for the Portuguese Consumer Association and a member of the Financial Services Users Group who works with the Commission on various topics, including fintech and crowdfunding. A couple of questions for Mr. Kuznetsov on your proposal from FISMA. We have contributed to that proposal with a couple of lines. We were in support of your proposal number 3, action item 3, which would be a more comprehensive EU directive or regulation on crowdfunding rather than this option 4, which was an opt-in regulation. But however, you proposed to go forward with that one. That's fine. A couple of questions. So how does it work when a platform is granted an authorization or label, but then is promoting services in member states which have limits on or caps on investments, such as France, Spain, and Portugal? How does that work where comparing to other member states, such as the UK, where there are no caps? Second question, which is a bit more complicated, is there any imposing on due diligence requirements and disclosure on default rates? These two items are very important and crucial for an understanding of whether the platform is actually credible, and if an investor should choose to do business with that platform. And finally, just a remark on a personal note and also on the FSEG side, we welcome the imposing of the distinction of PSD authorized services, entities to promote handling, money handling, which is crucial and very important for investor protection. Thank you.
Estou esquecendo de ligar o microfone. Não sei se me ouviram. Penso que sim, fui ouvido na sala. Há mais alguma pergunta que queiram colocar? Não há? Então.
Yes, thank you very much for this very valid intervention. I would like to also, in the interest of time, to just give very targeted responses. So the way the crowdfunding regime of the European Union would operate, it would work in parallel and not against the national regimes. So the way it is designed to operate, it shall be an opt-in, sort of additional voluntary regime for which entities can get authorization and license. In other words, if we're talking about, let's say, a national license, a national registration, which is set out in a member state, then it is perfectly possible for a European crowdfunding service provider to operate in parallel to the national authorization. To the extent that national member state has introduced caps or any requirements, those caps and those requirements would of course be valid with respect to entities operating under the national model. So in the European crowdfunding services provider regime, we don't introduce any caps on investment amounts. We thought that it would be disproportionate, unenforceable, very difficult, and it would probably not be calibrated, or to the extent that we will manage to calibrate, by the time we will achieve that, it would already be outdated. Now, you see, the way we have thought through this exercise is to really allow for very light touch, very proportionate regime. So there is, of course, a balance between the due diligence that crowdfunding service providers would exercise with respect to the project owners. But then, at the same time, the requirements are not so extensive, just because to the extent that crowdfunding service providers would attract, let's say, bad investments, that would imply fraud, or project owners would bring illegitimate investments, that would prejudice the reputation of the crowdfunding service providers. Yes, the crowdfunding regulation has set some basic requirements of diligence. There is a requirement to act in the best of the interest of clients, prospective clients, to act honestly, professionally, and fairly. And those general light touch requirements would of course apply, but we don't impose any hardcore between the rock and a hard place requirements in that respect. I don't know if that has answered completely your questions. But this is the way we see it.
Bom, há mais alguma pergunta que queiram colocar? Se não há, então vamos fazer aqui um pequeno intervalo para café. Até já.